I'm Jeremiah Poff, education reporter at the Washington Examiner. I'm here today with House Education Workforce Committee Chairwoman Virginia Foxx. Dr. Foxx, thank you so much for being here with me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Jeremiah.
I have to start out. You had a viral moment recently walking into the elevator while Congressman Byron Donalds was talking to the press. And I got to ask, are you ever going to start the elevator caucus?
No, I'm not going to start the elevator caucus, but it's very frustrating sometimes around here, Jeremiah. I know the press has a job to do, but during all of our time when we were trying to choose a speaker, the press just almost harassed us, and they blocked the hallways, they blocked the elevators. And I was very frustrated because I'm always in a hurry, and they're blocking the elevator, and I couldn't get to it. So I just said, please get out of the way.
So one thing Congressman Donalds said right after that was that he loved you, and that he always knew where you stand with Virginia Foxx. What kind of a reputation, that kind of reputation of being kind of a hard-nosed, no-nonsense woman, you're the chairwoman of the committee. How do you feel that reputation has made you an effective legislator, effective leader, and do you kind of embrace it?
I do. I came to Washington to work hard. I grew up extremely poor, Jeremiah. You'll never know anybody as poor as my husband and I were growing up in the mountains of North Carolina. And so I haven't had much time for frivolity. So I'm just a hardworking person. I've had to work hard all my life. And when I have a task to do, I go about it. I'm very task-oriented, and I go about doing it. We have a lot of work to do in this country. Our country's in big trouble, in my opinion. I think we are in big trouble. And so what I want to do is get to the job, get it done, move on to whatever the next task is. And so that's why you find me frustrated about not being able to get to the elevator or people wasting time, because once a minute is wasted, it can never be brought back.
You mentioned you grew, you lived poor for a long time, and I think you grew up poor.
Extremely poor. And both my husband and I were fortunate that we had people who steered us to get a good education. Again, you can get a good education, but if you still don't work hard at it, I don't think you can be successful. I've been moderately successful in business as well as in my chosen profession, which was education. I don't think politics is the sine qua non of a life. So I think you can be very successful without going into politics or without getting a baccalaureate degree. But you do need a certain level of skills, and you do need a certain amount of education. And you combine that with hard work, and you can get a lot accomplished.
I think you were first born in New York, in the Bronx, right?
Correct. And well, in Manhattan, actually, down on the Lower East Side, which was then considered Little Italy. There are several places in New York considered Little Italy, but my grandparents, my father's parents, were Italian immigrants, met and married when teenagers, or shoot, my grandmother was. And so I was born there, but we moved to North Carolina when I was 6.5. My mother was from that area. Her father had been a coal miner in Virginia. He died when she was 8 years old from black lung disease. Her mother moved to the mountains of North Carolina to be near family because she was destitute. And so that's where my mother grew up, and we moved there when I was 6.5.
Can you talk a little bit about how, Italian immigrant, New York, working class values, and then kind of that South rural, more kind of rugged values. Kind of how did those meld in your family and in you as you worked way through your.
Well, my father was always a hard worker. Again, you're right. First generation Italians. Well, my grandparents worked hard. My grandmother worked at home and cooked and cleaned, but crocheted for a living. And so my grandfather started out with a push cart and then got a small grocery store. They worked hard. My grandfather worked until a couple of years before he died. My grandmother worked up until the day she died. So my father learned to work hard. He was in the military during World War II. My mother had always worked hard. So it wasn't really too much of it was no clash of values in that respect. And my father adapted very well to living in the South. He's very personable. So it wasn't really much of a values clash at all.
I guess maybe I was just kind of, how did not so much that they clash, but it's certainly two different ways in general of living.
Sure.
But
and I was very grateful for that. Again, growing up in the mountains of North Carolina, I lived in rental houses with no electricity and no running water. But I knew when I would visit my grandparents in New York that there was a different way of living. Now they were, again, very lower middle class, lived in small apartments. But I knew there was a chance to have running water and electricity if you put yourself in the right circumstance. So I was glad for knowing those two worlds.
Is there a moment in your life that you kind of pinpoint, maybe earlier in life, that is you would say is instrumental in how you've approached life, how you've approached even governing in Congress, and kind of maybe like a character-defining moment?
I'm not sure there was. My senior year in high school, I had a student teacher who said to me, "You're smart, you need to go to college, you need to marry a man with a college education. Don't settle for less." I hadn't planned to go to college because I didn't have any money. But at the last minute, I took the SAT and I got into a junior college where I was a day student, and I did that. And then I dropped out of school because I had no money again and had to work. Went to New York City, lived with my grandparents who were still alive, they had a small apartment with two families living in it. And I worked on Wall Street for a while, or near Wall Street. And then I decided to go back to North Carolina. And I feel like God has guided me through my whole life, early on not knowing that God was in control. I was a religious person, but I realized when I was the president of the community college where I was president, God said to me one day, I was working with people that I didn't agree with, and he said, these people are like Joseph's brothers. They mean you ill, but I have a plan for you. And from then on, I had a real sense of God guiding my life. And never planned to be in public office when I was growing up, again, just trying to survive. But I knew then that God was controlling what I was doing.
So you mentioned that you were the president of a community college. What's more challenging, running a congressional committee or running a junior college?
Well, they're both challenging. You're in the personnel management. And so I had, about, I guess, not sure how many full-time people at the beginning, about 70 full-time people, but a lot of part-time people. And with the committee, we have approximately 50 full-time people, but our staff director does most of the personnel management. But as chair of the committee, I have to manage the members. And so that takes a lot of time in a sense, and I'm not managing anybody else. I'm not telling anybody what to do, but I need to understand what their wishes are, what their goals are, and work closely with them. So that, in a sense, you're in personnel management. And we're all independent contractors here in Congress, and people ask me all the time, why can't the Republicans do like the Democrats do and get all together? But we're much more independent contractors on the Republican side, and very opinionated.
You got a waiver to run the committee this Congress.
Correct.
Which I think was the only one granted.
Ever granted.
Right. So what kind of respect do you feel that your colleagues have for you? I know I'm kind of asking you to toot your own horn a little bit, but do you pride yourself on cultivating strong relationships with your colleagues and commanding that kind of respect that they would grant you that?
Well, I will tell you, I am extremely grateful that my colleagues did respect me enough to grant me a waiver. I think my colleagues do see in me a task-oriented person, a person who wants to get a job done, who's not climbing a political ladder, who has no personal agenda. I'm here to get a job done. Education is in big trouble in this country. Pensions are in big trouble. Healthcare is in big trouble. All of those issues are in our committee. Many people don't realize that, and all labor issues are in our committee. So people don't realize that we touch people in our committee more than any other committee in Congress, because we deal with people from the cradle to the grave. And so I don't say that I'm an expert in every single area, but I think my colleagues see me as working hard, and there's a certain respect that comes with experience. And again, I think they see me as totally devoted to getting my job done and to respecting morals and tradition and the things that made this country great, freedom. That is so important to us in this day and time. There is an administration here that is trying to take away all of our freedoms. And again, I think part of it is I'm in the right place at the right time. But again, I see that as part of God's will, is to put me there. But I'm very grateful for having gotten the waiver, because what it allows me to do is put my energy to work on what I know. And by the way, I'm the only member here that really has had the experience that I have. And so I think it certainly makes a difference in my being able to get the job done.
What about this particular moment with the Biden administration, what they've been doing, has made the education and labor and health care oversight so important?
Well, the Biden administration is really radical in its policies. President Biden campaigned on a free college education. He found out there was no appetite for that in Congress. And so he and his administration, they're trying to be the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. So they're pushing a free college education by looking for loopholes in legislation to transfer loan obligations from the people who took out the loans to the average taxpayer who has not gone to college and who did not take out the loans. So they're exploiting legislation passed by Congress that was never intended to do what it's doing, to, again, transfer loans to the wrong people. So that's one of the issues. They are putting their thumb on the scale in terms of labor unions. The president brags every day that he will be known as the most pro-union president ever, and he is certainly doing that. The NLRB is supposed to be a neutral arbiter of issues between management and labor unions. It is not being a neutral arbiter. It is involving itself in doing all kinds of illegal things in terms of union elections and making decisions about a lot of issues. They're pushing ESG in terms of pensions, which is not supposed to be done. The people who run pensions have a fiduciary responsibility to get the best return on investment for the person who put his or her money into the pension. They are trying to push their green agenda. So this committee is seeing every radical idea of the Biden administration being pushed. Healthcare, for example. They're trying to push everybody onto Obamacare and diluting the good about employer-sponsored health care. That's where we get involved. We have the jurisdiction over more health care in our committee than any other committee in Congress, because we have employer-sponsored health care under ERISA, and that's 150 million people. They're trying to take them out of employer-sponsored health care to try to discourage them from working. So we have every issue. We do have child care, as you mentioned. We have every issue that the Biden administration is pushing radically right now.
on a legislative front, you guys have passed a couple of bills in this Congress. Obviously, some of them they're unlikely to pass the Senate under Democratic control. But one of the specific ones that I'm thinking of is the Women's Sports Act, I think it's the Save Women's Sports Act.
Yeah, protecting women and girls in sports, I think, is the correct title. I have to think about that a little bit, but that's. Yeah.
But I want to ask you how you've had a pretty successful and long career. Do you see when you're passing a bill like that? Do you feel like you personally are? This is kind of like you're paying forward the opportunities that you had, and what do you see as your role as a legislator, as a woman legislator, as in protecting women's sports and women and opportunities for girls in education?
Right. Well, I have to say that the primary sponsor of that bill was a man, Greg Stubbe from Florida, but certainly all the women got behind that bill, and he's not on the committee, so it came to our committee because that's where it belongs. But yes, I do feel it's important to pay forward and to push legislation that is going to mean a lot in the future. It's a good piece of legislation. Look, I've been castigated for saying that there's no such thing as a transgender woman or a transgender man. A person cannot change one's gender. And what we were doing in the Protecting Women and Girls in Sports Act was to say, we want only biological women to compete against biological women and only biological men to compete against biological men. So we were protecting women from losing scholarships, losing recognition, and just losing self-worth from being able to achieve in her sport by having men who have physical advantages over women in almost all cases from taking away pride and scholarships and awards. That's all it is let's recognize that women are women, men are men. It's a really simple concept. God created us that way, and we know that.
So you obviously have a background in higher education, especially. Campus free speech has been an issue that you've done a lot of work on. But over the last month, there's been kind of a bigger issue that's come out ever since the attacks in Israel by Hamas. And there's been a lot of these protests on college campuses. And it's kind of raising an issue. Is there a tension between supporting free expression and allowing some of these protests and statements from these students some of them are excusing the attacks? Do you see that there's a tension there, and what do you see as the committee's role in maybe overseeing this, because so many of these institutions are receiving federal funding?
Well, almost all but I think 7 institutions in this country do receive some form of taxpayer funding at from the federal level. I'm very careful not to talk about government funding because it's money that comes from taxpayers to the government, and then we spend that money on their behalf. So yes, there's a tension, and there are people that would like to stifle free speech. The way the committee is coming at it is we want there to be transparency in the policies that the colleges and universities have. Especially public universities, they cannot in any way stifle free speech. We're very concerned about that. And we want to put all schools on notice that it's up to them to inform students and parents as to what their policies are. We'll be coming out with a bill probably next week dealing with this issue, but in everything that we do, we're extraordinarily careful not to put Congress in a position to try to one-up the Constitution. The Constitution's very clear on what our rights are and that the government shall not infringe upon those rights. That's the particular way that we have to look at it. That's the way the Constitution talks about it, shall not infringe. And so we have to be very careful about that in what kind of prescriptions we put out. But we will focus on transparency, and we certainly will focus on the rights that people have.
Do these protests at all concern you about the state of higher education, that you have these student groups expressing support for a terrorist group?
They absolutely distress me over the fact that these students close their minds. Colleges and universities are supposed to open people's minds and to help them learn. And it is really clear to me that these students have had their minds closed by being more indoctrinated than by being educated. And it is very troubling to me that we have colleges and universities with professors who are doing that. That is not what a college education should be about, and it's not what our country should be about. We need to make sure these students are learning the facts and not being indoctrinated.
And last question, you guys just elected a new speaker. Are you hopeful that you can put this whole saga behind you guys of this, the speakership, and kind of get back to work? And what do you have looking forward? What are you looking forward to in the rest of this Congress?
Well, first of all, I think that Mike Johnson is going to be a fabulous speaker. He is a very kind, extremely intelligent, very fair-minded person who is grounded in the kind of morality that I want to see a person grounded in. He is a real student of the Constitution. He was a constitutional lawyer. He worked in conservative circles. But his first comment yesterday said to the Democrats, "I want to work with you." And I think that was a very good comment to make. He's not going to undermine his own values and his own moral structure to do that, but he will reach out and try to do everything that he can to advance legislation in a way that we can make a change in this country, make good government. You said earlier that bills that are passing the House aren't going to get passed in the Senate. Well, if we don't pass them in the House, there's no chance they'll get passed in the Senate. So it's very, very important that we state our positions and send legislation to the Senate. And in most cases, our legislation is bipartisan. But I think you will see a really, really strong and good and positive speaker in Speaker Mike Johnson. He is going to do a great job.
Dr. Foxx, thank you so much for joining us today. You can read more at washingtonexaminer.com.